It was not comforting talk when one's wife was said to be on a whiskey boat going up the Arkansas. "Planning a trip to Colorado?" Will Barger asked. "I don't know," July said. "Maybe." "Well, if you go on up the plains and get scalped, there'll be that much less law in Arkansas," Will Barger said. "But then there might not be that much crime in Arkansas now. I guess most of the crimes moved to Texas." July wasn't listening. He was trying to convince himself that Peach was wrong, that Elmira had just gone wandering for a few days. When Will Barger started to move on, July did not. "Thanks for the company," he said. "I think we better go look for my deputy." "There's a perfectly straight trail from Fort Smith into Texas," Will Barger said. "Captain Marcy laid it out. If that deputy can't even stay in a road, I expect you ought to fire him." Then he loped away without saying goodbye. Joe wished they were going with him. In only a few hours, the man had paid him several compliments and had offered to hire him. He found himself feeling resentful both of July and Roscoe. July didn't seem to know what he wanted to do, and as for Roscoe, if he couldn't stay in a road, then he deserved to be lost. He wished he had spoken up and grabbed the job when Will Barger offered it. But the moment had been missed. Will Barger was already out of sight, and they were still standing there. July looked depressed, as he had ever since they had left Fort Smith. Finally, without a word, he turned east, back toward Arkansas. Joe wished he was old enough to point out to July that nothing he was doing made any sense, but he knew July probably wouldn't even hear him in the state he was in. Joe felt annoyed, but he kept quiet and followed along. Chapter 52. The amazing thing about Janey, in Roscoe's view, was that she knew her way. Almost as amazing was that she liked to walk. The first day or two it felt a little wrong that he was riding and she was walking, but she was just a slip of a girl, and he was a grown man and a deputy besides. He pointed out to her that she was welcome to ride. She weighed practically nothing, and anyway, they weren't traveling fast enough to tire a horse. But Janey didn't want to ride. "I'll walk, and all you have to do is keep up," she said. Of course, it was no trouble for a man on horseback to keep up with a girl on foot, and Roscoe began to relax and even to enjoy the trip a little. It was pretty weather. All he had to do was trot along and think. What he mostly thought about was how surprised July would be when they showed up and told him the news. Not only could Janey keep them on the trail, but she was also extremely useful when it came to rounding up grub. Once they got settled in a camp at night, she would disappear and come back 5 minutes later with a rabbit or a possum or a couple of squirrels. She could even catch birds. Once she came back with a fat, brownish bird of a sort Roscoe had never seen. "Now, what bird is that?" he asked. "Prairie chicken," Janey said. "There was two, but one got away." They ate the prairie chicken, and it was as good as any regular chicken Roscoe had ever had. Janey cracked open the bones with her teeth and sucked out the marrow. The only problem with her at all, from Roscoe's point of view, was that she was tormented by bad dreams and whimpered at night. Roscoe loaned her a blanket, thinking she might be cold, but that wasn't it. Even wrapped in a blanket, she still whimpered, and because of that didn't sleep much. He would awake in the grayness just before dawn and see Janey sitting up, stirring the little campfire and scratching her ankles. She was barefoot, of course, and her ankles and shins were scratched by the rough grass she went through each day. "Did you never have any shoes?" he asked once. "Never did," Janey said, as if it didn't matter. The only times she would consent to crawl up on the horse was when they had a sizable creek to cross. She didn't like wading in deep water. "'Fraid of them snappers," she said. "If one of them was to bite me, I'd die." "They're mighty slow," Roscoe said. "It's easy to outrun 'em." "I dream about them," Janey said, not reassured. "They just keep coming, and I can't run." Except for snapping turtles and sleep, she seemed to fear nothing. Many times coiled rattlers would sing at them as they traveled, and Janey would never give the snakes a glance. Old Memphis was more nervous about snakes than she was, and Roscoe more nervous than either one of them. He had once heard of a man being bitten by a rattlesnake that had gotten up in a tree. According to the story, the snake had dropped right off a limb and onto the man, and had bitten him in the neck. Roscoe imagined how unpleasant it could be to have a snake drop on one's neck. He took care to ride under as few limbs as possible, and was glad to see the trees thinning out as they rode west. It seemed they were on a fairly good trail, for every day they encountered 3 or 4 travelers, sometimes more. Once they caught up with a family plodding along in a wagon. It was such a large family that it looked like a small town on the move, particularly if you wanted to count the livestock. The old man of the family, who was driving the team, didn't seem talkative, but his wife was. "We're from Missouri," she said. "We're going west, and I guess we'll stop when we feel like it. We've got 14 young'uns, and are hoping to establish a farm." 8 or 9 of the young ones were riding in the wagon. They stared at Roscoe and Janey as silent as owls. Several times they met soldiers going east toward Fort Smith. The soldiers were a taciturn lot and passed without much talk. Roscoe attempted to inquire about July, but the soldiers made it clear that they had better things to do than keep a lookout for Arkansas sheriffs. Janey was shy of people. She had keen eyesight and would usually see other travelers before Roscoe did. Often, when she saw one, she disappeared, darting off the trail and hiding in weeds and tall grass until the stranger passed. "What are you hiding for?" Roscoe asked. "Them soldiers ain't after you." "Bill might be with them," Janey said. "Bill who?" "Bill," she repeated. "He gave me to old Sam. I ain't going with Bill again." She continued to hide at the approach of strangers, and once in a while Roscoe had to admit that it was well she did. There were some rough customers traveling the trail. One day they met 2 dirty-looking men with greasy beards and 6 or 7 guns between them. Roscoe had an anxious moment, for the men stopped him and asked to borrow tobacco. The fact that he was traveling without any didn't sit well with them, and they looked as if they might contest the issue. "I reckon you're lying," one said. He was a small fellow, but had mean little eyes and was generally more frightening than his companion, a man the size of an ox, who seemed to take no interest in the conversation. "Why would a man travel without nothing to smoke?" the little one asked. "It never agreed with me," Roscoe explained. "I had to give it up." "If you was more dried up, I guess we could smoke you," the little one said with mean intent. But the men rode on, and Roscoe soon forgot about them and began to feel drowsy. The day was muggy, and occasionally he would see lightning flicker in the west. After a while it struck him that something was missing, and he figured out that it was Janey. Usually, once the travelers were out of sight, she reappeared. Memphis had come to trust her and would follow her like a pet goat. Only this time she wasn't there to follow. Roscoe looked all around, and there wasn't a soul in sight, though the plain stretched out and he could see for miles. He was alone, and by no means sure of his direction. It scared him. He had come to depend on the girl, even though she was a loud sleeper. He yelled a time or 2, but got no response. The fact that he could see so far scared him a little. He had been raised in a land of trees and was not used to country that looked so long and empty. How he could have lost Janey in such an open place was a mystery to him. He sat still for a while, hoping she would pop up, but she didn't, and finally he rode on at a slow walk. An hour passed, and then another, and Roscoe was forced to consider the possibility that he might have lost the girl. One of the snakes she took so little notice of could have bitten her. She could be dying somewhere back along the trail. If she wasn't going to reappear, it was his duty to go back and find her, and as sunset was not far off, and it looked like thunderstorms were on the way, he had better hurry. He turned and started back at a trot, but had not gone 20 paces before Janey popped up from behind a bush and jumped right up on Memphis. "They're following," she said. "I've been watching. I guess they want to kill you." "Well, they won't find no tobacco even if they do," Roscoe said. Still, the little one had had a bad pair of eyes, and he could easily believe they meant to harm him. He wheeled the horse around and started to put him into a run, but Janey jerked on the reins. "They're in front of us," she said. "They got around while you was poking along." Roscoe had never felt so at a loss. There was not so much as a tree in sight, and it was a long way back to Fort Smith. He didn't see how the men could expect to ambush him in the open plain. "Darn," he said, feeling hopeless. "I can't figure which way to run." Janey pointed north. "Up that way," she said. "There's a gully." Roscoe couldn't see what good a gully would do, but he took her advice, and they set off north at a dead run. Memphis was shocked to be spurred into a run, but once he got started, he ran with a will. Once again, Janey was right. They had only been running half a mile when they struck a big gully. Roscoe stopped and looked around. Not a soul was in sight, which made him feel silly. What were they to do next? "Can you shoot?" Janey asked, jumping down. "Well, I have shot," Roscoe said. "There ain't been nobody much to shoot at in Fort Smith. Sometimes July and I shoot at pumpkins or bottles and things. July's a good shot, but I'm just fair. I expect I could hit that big fella, but I don't know about the little one." "Give me the pistol. I'll shoot him for you," Janey said. "Would you ever shoot?" he asked, surprised. "Give it to me," Janey said, and when he slowly handed it over, she hopped off the horse, climbed out of the gully, and disappeared. 5 minutes later, before he could even untie his tarp, it began to rain. Lightning started hitting the ground, and it rained torrents. Roscoe got totally soaked. In 10 minutes, there was a little river running down the middle of the gully, though the gully had been bone dry when they rode up. The thunder crashed, and it grew dark. Roscoe felt that he had never hated travel so much, not even when the pigs chased him. He was alone, and likely either to be drowned or shot before the night was over, or even well begun. He remembered how snug and secure the jail was back in Fort Smith. How nice it was to come in slightly drunk and have a comfortable couch to lie on. It was a life he fervently wished he had never left. The rain increased until it seemed to Roscoe it was raining as hard as it could possibly rain. He didn't try to seek shelter, for there was none. It was uncomfortable to be so soaked, but since the water was probably all that was keeping him from being murdered by the little man with the mean eyes, it was silly to complain. Roscoe just sat, hoping that the little creek that filled the gully wouldn't rise enough to drown him. The storm turned out to be just a heavy shower. In 10 minutes the rain lightened, and soon it was barely sprinkling. The sun had set, but to the west there was a clear band of sky under the clouds, and the clouds were thinning. The band of sky became red with afterglow. Above it, as the clouds thinned, there was a band of white, and then a deep blue, with the evening star in it. Roscoe dismounted and stood there dripping, aware that he ought to be planning some form of defense, but unable to think of any. It seemed to him the storm might have discouraged the two men. Maybe one of them had even been struck by lightning. Before he could draw much comfort from that line of speculation, he heard his own gun go off. A second or two later it went off again, and then again. The sound came from just north of the gully. As he could not be any wetter, and could not stand the suspense of not knowing what was going on, he waded the little creek and climbed the bank, only to look and see the barrels of a shotgun not a yard from his face. The ox of a man held the shotgun. In his big hands it looked tiny, though the barrels in Roscoe's face seemed as big as cannons. "Clamber on up here, traveler," the big man said. July had told him never to argue with a loaded gun, and Roscoe had no intention of disobeying his instructions. He climbed up the muddy bank and saw that Janey was involved in a tussle with the little outlaw. He had her down and was astraddle of her and was trying to tie her, but Janey was wiggling desperately. She was covered with mud, and in the wet, slick grass was proving hard to subdue. The man cuffed her twice, but the blows had no effect that Roscoe could see. The big man with the shotgun seemed to find the tussle amusing. He walked over for a closer look, though he continued to keep the shotgun pointed at Roscoe. "Why don't you just shoot her?" he asked the little man. "She was willing to shoot you." The little man didn't answer. He was breathing hard, but he continued to try and tie Janie's wrists. Roscoe had to admire Janie's spunk. The situation looked hopeless, but she kept struggling, twisting around and scratching at the man when she could. Finally, the big man stepped in and planted a muddy boot on one of her arms, enabling his companion to tie her wrists. The little man cuffed her again for good measure and sat back to get his breath. He looked around at Roscoe, his eyes as bad as ever. "Where'd you get this feisty rabbit?" he asked. "She darn near shot me, and she nicked Hutto." "We're from Arkansas," Roscoe said. He felt foolish for having given Janie the pistol. After all, he was the deputy. On the other hand, if they had seen him shoot, the men might have shot back. "Let's just shoot them and take the horse," Hutto, the big man, said. "We could have done it this afternoon and saved all this time." "Yeah, and the darn soldiers would have found them," the other said. "You can't just leave bodies lying right in the road no more. Somebody's apt to take an interest." "Jim, you're too nervous," Hutto said. "Anyway, this ain't a road, and we ain't far from the territory. Let's shoot 'em and take what they got." "What have they got, by God?" Jim asked. "Go bring the horse." Hutto brought Memphis, and the two amused themselves for a few minutes by going through the bedroll and the saddlebags. One kept Roscoe covered with the shotgun, while the other emptied the contents of the saddlebags carelessly on the wet grass. What they saw was very disappointing to them. "All right, Jim, I told you they looked like a waste of time," Hutto said. "Well, there's a horse at least," Jim said. Then he gave Roscoe a mean look. "Strip off them duds," he said. "What?" Roscoe asked. "Strip off them duds," the man repeated. He picked up Roscoe's pistol, which had fallen in the grass, and pointed it at him. "Why must I?" Roscoe asked. "Well, your underwear might fit me," Jim suggested. "You ain't got much else to offer." Roscoe was forced to take off every bit of clothing. He felt miserable taking off his boots, for he knew that, wet as they were, he'd be lucky to get them back on. But then, if he was dead, it wouldn't matter. When he got down to his long johns, he became embarrassed, for after all, Janie was sitting there watching. She was wet and muddy and hadn't said a word. The man seemed to think he might have money sewed in his long johns, and insisted he take them off. Hutto poked him with the barrels of the shotgun, something he couldn't ignore. He took them off and stood there naked, hoping Janie wouldn't look. Of course, the men found the $30 he was carrying in his old wallet. It represented a month's wages, and was all he had to finish the trip with. But they had found that before they made him strip. They seemed reluctant to believe it was all the money he had, and casually proceeded to pick his clothes apart with their knives. "The $30 is all I got," he said several times. "I guess you wouldn't be the first man to lie," Jim said, picking at the seams of his pants to see if he had any greenbacks sewed in them. Roscoe was appalled, for the clothes that were being destroyed were the only ones he owned. Then he remembered that he was going to be killed anyway and felt a little better. It was very embarrassing to him to have to stand there naked. The men weren't watching Janie. They were too intent on trying to find money in his saddlebags. While they were all ignoring her, she had been quietly scooting backwards on the slick grass. Jim had his back to her, and Hutto was winding Roscoe's old pocket watch. Roscoe happened to look and saw that Janie was quietly creeping away. They had tied her hands, but had neglected her feet. Suddenly she began to run. It was deep dusk, and in a second she had got into the tall grass north of the gully. She made no sound, but Hutto must have sensed something, for he whirled and let go a blast with the shotgun. Roscoe flinched. Hutto fired the other barrel, and Jim turned and shot 3 times with Roscoe's own pistol, which he had stuck in his belt. Roscoe peered into the dusk, but there was no sign of Janey. The bandits looked, too, with no better luck. "Reckon we hit her?" Jim asked. "Nope," Hutto said. "She got in that tall grass." "Well, she could be hit," Jim said. "I could be General Lee, only I ain't," Hutto remarked, looking disgusted. "Why didn't you tie her feet?" "Why didn't you?" Jim retorted. "I wasn't sitting on her," Hutto said. "You watch this one and I'll go catch her," Jim said. "I bet once I do she won't get away for a while." "Why, Jim, you can't catch her," Hutto said. "In this dark? Remember how she ambushed us? If she was a better shot, we'd both be corpses. And if she's got a rifle hid out there somewhere, we may be corpses yet." "I ain't scared of her," Jim said. "Darn her, I should have cracked her with a gun barrel a time or two." "You should have shot her," Hutto said. "I know you expected to amuse yourself, but look how it turned out. The girl got away, and the deputy only had $30 and some dirty underwear." "She can't be far," Jim said. "Let's camp and look for her in the morning." "Well, you can, but I'm going," Hutto said. "A girl that size ain't worth tracking." Just as he said it, a good-sized rock came flying through the air and hit him right in the mouth. He was so surprised he slipped and sat down. The rock had smashed his lips. Blood poured down his chin. A second later, another hit Jim in the ribs. Jim drew a pistol and fired several times in the direction the rocks came from. "Oh, stop wasting shells," Hutto said. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Two more rocks came flying in, both aimed at Jim. One hit him right in the elbow, causing him to double over in pain. The other flew over his head. Hutto seemed to think the whole thing was funny. He sat on the muddy ground, laughing and spitting great mouthfuls of blood. Jim crouched down, pistol drawn, watching for rocks. "This beats all I ever heard of," Hutto said. "Here we are in a rock fight with a girl no bigger than a minute, and she's winning. If news of this gets out, we'll have to retire." He looked at Roscoe, who was standing stock still. One of the rocks had just missed him. He didn't want to move and risk interfering with Janey's aim. "By God, when I get her, she'll wish she'd kept a-running," Jim said, cocking his gun. A second later, a rock hit him on the shoulder, and the gun went off. Furious, he fired into the darkness until the pistol was empty. "Well, we'll sure have to kill this deputy now," Hutto remarked. He wiggled a loose tooth with a bloody finger. "If he was to tell about this, our reputation as desperados would be ruined forever." "Then why don't you get up and help me rush her?" Jim said angrily. "Oh, I think we should just sit and let her chunk us to death," Hutto said. "I think it serves us right for being idiots. You was scared of this deputy when he ain't no more dangerous than a chicken. Maybe next time you'll be content to shoot when I want to shoot." Jim opened his pistol. He was trying to reload and watch for rocks, too, squinting into the darkness. Another rock came in low, and he managed to turn and take it on his thigh, but it caused him to drop 3 bullets. Roscoe was beginning to feel more hopeful. He was remembering all the varmints Janey had brought into camp. Probably she had used them to sharpen her aim. His hope was she'd start throwing for the head before the men got around to killing him. Hutto was calmer than Jim. He reached over, got his shotgun, and broke the breech. "I tell you, Jim," he said, "you just keep sitting there drawing her fire. I'll load up with some buckshot. Maybe if she don't brain you before the moon rises, I can catch the angle and shoot her, or at least chase her out of chunking range." He reached into the pocket of his buckskin coat for some shells, and as he did, a miracle happened. For in Roscoe's mind, a miracle it was. He stood there, naked and wet, sure to be murdered within a few minutes unless a slip of a girl, armed only with rocks, could defeat 2 grown men armed with guns. He himself was so sure of being killed that he felt rather detached from what was happening, and invested only faint hope in Janey's chances of saving him. Nobody saw July come. Hutto was reaching in his pocket for shells, and Jim was trying to fish those he had dropped out of the mud. Roscoe was watching Jim, whom he liked least. He was hoping to see a big rock hit Jim right between the eyes, perhaps cracking his skull. It wouldn't stop Hutto from killing him, but it would be consolation if Jim got his skull cracked first. Then, at the same moment, Jim, Hutto, and he himself all became aware that someone was there who hadn't been. It was July Johnson, standing behind Jim with his pistol drawn and cocked. "You won't need them shells," July said quietly. "Just leave 'em lie."
"Well, you son of a bitch," Jim said. "What gives you the right to pull a gun on me?"
Jim looked up, and just as he did, the rock Roscoe had been hoping for sailed in and hit him right in the throat. He dropped his gun and fell over backwards. He lay there clutching his throat and trying desperately to draw breath. Hutto had 2 shotgun shells in his hand, but he didn't try to shove them in the shotgun. "I've had bad luck before, but nothing to top this," he said, ignoring July and looking at Roscoe. "Can't you at least make that gal stop throwing rocks?" Roscoe was having trouble believing what he saw. He felt he had missed a step or two in the proceedings somehow. "Are you going to get your clothes on, or are you just going to stand there?" July asked. It sounded like July, and it looked like July, so Roscoe was forced to conclude that he was saved. He had been in the process of adjusting to impending death, and it seemed to him a part of him must already have left for the other place, because he felt sort of absent and dull. Ordinarily, he would not have stood around on a muddy prairie, naked, and yet in some ways it was easier than having to pick up the pieces of his life again, which meant, first off, having to literally pick up pieces of his clothes. "They cut up my duds," he said to July. "I doubt I'll ever be able to get them boots back on, wet as they are." "Joe, bring the handcuffs," July said. Joe walked into camp with 2 sets of handcuffs. It shocked him to see Roscoe naked. "I never seen so many young'uns," Hutto said. "Can this one throw rocks, too?" "Who is throwing the rocks?" July asked. He had been about to step in before the rock throwing started, but the rock thrower's accuracy had been so startling that he had waited a few minutes to watch the outcome. "That's Janie," Roscoe said, buttoning up what was left of his best shirt. "She practices chunking varmints. It's how we've been getting our grub." July quickly handcuffed Jim, who was still writhing around on the grass. The blow to the throat seemed to have damaged his windpipe. He gasped loudly for air like a drowning man. "You might shoot me, but you ain't putting no darn cuffs on me," Hutto said when July approached him. "This is July Johnson, and I wouldn't fight him," Roscoe said. For some reason he felt rather friendly to Hutto, though it was Hutto who had been most inclined to kill him. Hutto didn't fight, but neither did he get handcuffed, for the simple reason that his wrists were too big. July was forced to tie him with a saddle string, a method he would rather have avoided. A man as large as Hutto would eventually stretch out any rope or piece of rawhide if he kept trying. Roscoe managed to get his pants to hold together pretty well, although they were full of holes. As predicted, he could not get his boots on. Joe helped, but the 2 of them made no headway. "It's a good thing you shot," Joe said. "We was already camped, but July recognized your gun." "Oh, was that it?" Roscoe said, reluctant to admit that it had been Janie who shot. Once the men were handcuffed and tied, July got them onto their horses and tied their feet to the stirrups. Hutto and Jim he knew by reputation, for they had harried the East Texas trails for the last year or 2, mostly robbing settlers, but occasionally killing those who put up a fight. He had expected to find Roscoe eventually, but not the 2 bandits. Now something would have to be done with them before he could even ask Roscoe all the questions he wanted to ask about Elmira. Also, there was the rock thrower, Janie, Roscoe had called her. Why was there a Janie traveling with Roscoe? Indeed, where was she? The rock throwing had stopped, but no one had appeared. Now that the danger was past, Roscoe began to feel that there were many awkward matters awaiting explanation. He had forgotten about Elmira and her departure for several days, although her departure was the reason he was in Texas. Also, he would have to explain to July why he was traveling with a young girl. It seemed better to talk about the miracle of July's appearance, but July didn't want to say much about it. "I never expected to see you right then," Roscoe said. "Then there you were, pointing that gun." "This is the main trail to Texas from Fort Smith," July pointed out. "If I was looking for you, that's where I'd likely be." "Yeah, but I didn't know you was looking for me," Roscoe said.
You don't usually."
"Peach wrote and told me you was on the way," July said. It was all the explanation he planned to offer until he could get Roscoe alone. "I guess we're caught. But what next?" Hutto asked. He did not like to be left out of conversations. Jim, who still had to suck hard to get his breath, showed no inclination to talk. "You say there's a girl?" July asked.
"Yep, Janey."
"Call her in," July said. Roscoe made an effort, but it went awkwardly.
"Come on, July's here," he said loudly into the darkness. "It's safe. He's the sheriff I work for," he added just as loudly.
There was no sound from the darkness and no sign of Janey. Roscoe could tell July was impatient. It made him nervous. He remembered how Janey had disappeared for 2 hours that afternoon. If she thought July would wait 2 hours, she didn't know much about him.
"Come on in. We've got these men tied," he said, without much hope that Janey would obey.
She didn't. There was not a sound to be heard except for some coyotes singing about a mile away. "I suspect that girl has Indian blood," Hutto said. "She had us ambushed, fair and square, and if she was as good with a pistol as she is with a rock, we'd be dead." "What's the matter with her?" July asked. "Why won't she come?"
"I don't know," Roscoe said. "She don't take to company, I guess."
July thought it a very odd business. Roscoe had never been one to womanize. In fact, around Fort Smith, his skill in avoiding various widow women had often been commented on. And yet he had somehow taken up with a girl who could throw rocks more accurately than most men could shoot. "I don't intend to spend the night here," July said. "Has she got a horse?"
"No, but she's quick of foot," Roscoe said. "She's been keeping ahead of me without no trouble. Where are we going?"
"To Fort Worth," July said. "The sheriff there will probably be glad to get these men." "Yes, he will, the son of a bitch," Hutto said. Roscoe felt bad about going off and leaving Janey, but he couldn't think what to do about it. July tied the 2 outlaws' horses to a single lead rope and instructed Roscoe and Joe to stay close behind them. It had clouded up and was almost pitch dark, but that had no effect on July's pace, which was fast. Having to deliver the outlaws to justice was taking him out of his way, but there was nothing else for it. When they had been riding about an hour, Roscoe got the scare of his life, for suddenly someone jumped on the horse behind him. For a terrifying second, he thought Jim must have gotten loose and come to strangle him or stick a knife in him. Memphis was startled, too, and jumped sideways into Joe's horse. Then he heard the person panting and knew it was Janey.
"I couldn't keep up no longer," she said. "I thought he'd slow down, but he just keeps going."
Joe was so startled to see a girl materialize behind Roscoe that he didn't say a word. He found it hard to credit that the person who had thrown the rocks could be a girl. Yet he had seen the rocks hit the men. How could a girl throw so hard and straight? July had appropriated Hutto's shotgun, loaded it, and put it across his saddle. He assumed it would make the prisoners think twice before starting trouble. His one thought was to get back to Fort Worth, turn the men over, and start at once to look for Elmira. They rode all night, and when the plains got gray, they were no more than 5 miles from Fort Worth. He glanced back at the prisoners and was startled to see the girl riding behind Roscoe. She looked very young. Her bare legs were as thin as a bird's. Roscoe was slumped over the horn, asleep, and the girl held the reins. She was also watching the 2 prisoners, both of whom were plenty wide awake. July got down and checked Hutto's knots, which indeed were slipping. "I guess you're Janey," he said to the girl. She nodded. July handed her the shotgun to hold while he retied Hutto.
"My God, don't do that. She's apt to cut us in 2, Jim said.
His voice had a husky croak from the blow in his throat. It pained him to speak, but the sight of the girl with the shotgun clearly pained him more. Joe had managed to get the sleep out of his eyes and was rather aggrieved that July had given the gun to the girl. She was no older than he was, and she was female. He felt he ought to have been given the shotgun. "You don't give a man much of a chance, do you?" Hutto said as July retied him. He was a messy sight from all the dried blood on his mouth and his beard, but he seemed cheerful. "Nope," July said. "If they don't hang us, you better watch out for Jim," Hutto said. "Jim hates to have anyone point a gun at him. He's got a vengeful nature, too." Jim did seem vengeful. His eyes were shining with hatred, and he was looking at the girl. The look was so hot that many men would have flinched from it, but the girl didn't. All the while, Roscoe slumped over his horse's neck, snoring away. They were nearly on the outskirts of Fort Worth before he woke up, and it was not until July handed the prisoners over to the sheriff that he began to feel alive. Janey had acted like she wanted to bolt when they came into town. The sight of so many wagons and people clearly upset her, but she held on. July found a livery stable, for it would be necessary to rest the horses for a while. It was run by a woman who kindly offered to scrape up a little breakfast for the youngsters. It consisted of cornbread and bacon, which they ate sitting on big washtubs outside the woman's house. Roscoe's clothes were practically in ribbons, so much so that the woman laughed when she saw him. She offered to mend his clothes for another 50 cents, but Roscoe had to decline, since he had nothing to wear while the work was being done. "This is a big-looking town," Roscoe said. "I guess I can buy myself some clothes." "Not for no 50 cents, the woman said. "That's nothing but a sack the girl's wearing. You ought to get her something decent to wear while you're buying." "Well, I might," Roscoe said. It was true that Janey's dress was a mere rag. Janey seemed to think Fort Worth was quite a sight. She was over her fright, and she looked around with interest. "Is that girl your daughter?" the woman asked. "No," Roscoe said. "I never saw her till last week." "Well, she's somebody's daughter, and she deserves better than a sack to wear," the woman said. "That boy's dressed all right. How come you skimped on the girl?" "No opportunity," Roscoe said. "I just found her up in the country." The woman had a red face, and it got redder when she was angry, as she now clearly was. "I don't know what to think of you men," she said, and went in her house and slammed the door. "Where did you get her?" July asked. "I didn't get her exactly," Roscoe said. He felt on the defensive. It was clear that people would think the worst of him, whatever he did. No doubt in Fort Smith the word would be out that instead of sticking to orders, he had run off with the first young girl he could find. "She run off and followed me," he added. July looked noncommittal. "A dern old man beat her and used her hard, and that's why she run off," Roscoe elaborated. "Can we go to a saloon? I'd sure fancy a beer." July took him to a saloon and bought him a beer. Now that he had Roscoe alone, he felt curiously reluctant to mention Elmira. Even hearing her name spoken would be painful. "What about Ellie?" he said finally. "Peach said she left." "Well, Peach is right," Roscoe said. "Or if she didn't leave, then she's hiding, or else a bear got her." "Did you see bear tracks?" July asked. "No," Roscoe admitted. "Then a bear didn't get her," July said. "She probably left on the whiskey boat," Roscoe said, trying to hide behind his beer glass. "I don't see why," July said softly, almost to himself. He didn't see why. He had never done anything to disturb her that he could remember. He had never hit her or even spoken harshly to her. What would prompt a woman to run off when nothing was wrong? Of course, it wasn't true that nothing had been wrong. Something had been. He just didn't know what. He didn't know why she had married him if she didn't like him, and he had the sense that she didn't. It was true that Peach had hinted a few times that people got married for reasons other than liking, but Peach was known to be cynical. Now, in the saloon, he remembered Peach's hints. Maybe Ellie had never liked him. Maybe she had married him for reasons she hadn't wanted to mention. Thinking about it all made him feel very sad. "Did you talk to her at all after I left?" he asked Roscoe. "No," Roscoe admitted. July didn't speak for 5 minutes. Roscoe turned over in his mind various excuses for not seeing Elmira, but in truth it had never once occurred to him to go and see her. He slowly drank his beer. "What about Jake?" he asked. "He's to the south," July said. "He's coming with a trail herd. I want to find Ellie. Once that's done, we'll look for Jake." He fished some money out of his pocket and paid for the beers. "Maybe you ought to take the young ones and go back to Arkansas," he said. "I'm going after Ellie."
"Well, I'll come with you," Roscoe said.
Now that he had found July, he had no intention of losing him again. He had had plenty of trouble coming, and yet worse might occur if he tried to go back on his own. "I expect if we paid that woman, she'd board the girl," July said. "You go buy some duds. You'll be a laughingstock if you try to travel in those you got on." The woman at the livery stable agreed to board Janey for $3 a month. July paid for 2 months. When told she was to stay in Fort Worth, Janey didn't say a word. The woman spoke to her cheerfully about getting some better clothes, but Janey sat on the washtub, silent. The woman offered to take Joe, too, and board him free if he would help out around the livery stable. July was tempted, but Joe looked so unhappy that he relented and decided to let him stay with them. Then Roscoe showed up, in clothes that looked so stiff it was a wonder he could even walk in them.
"I guess you might break them clothes in by Christmas," the livery stable woman said, laughing. "You look like you're wearing stovepipes."
"I can't help it if they're black," Roscoe said. "It was all they had that fit." He felt sorry about leaving Janey. What if old Sam got well and tracked them to Fort Worth and found her? He offered her $2 in case she had expenses, but Janey just shook her head. When they rode off, she was still sitting on the big washtub. Joe was glad she wasn't coming. She made him feel that he didn't do things very well. He didn't have long to enjoy being glad, though. That night they camped on the plains, 20 miles north of Fort Worth. July felt it was all right to sleep without a guard, as there were trail herds on both sides of them. They could hear the night herders singing to the cattle. In the morning, when Joe opened his eyes, Janey was squatting by the cold campfire. She still wore her sack. Even July had not heard her come. When July woke up, she handed him back the $6 he had given the woman. July just took it, looking surprised. Joe felt annoyed. It was wrong of the girl to come without July's permission. If the Indians carried her off, he, for one, would not be too sorry, although when he thought about it, he realized he himself might be an easier catch. The girl had followed them at night across the plains. It was something he couldn't have done. All that day the girl ran along on her own, never getting far behind. She was not like any of the girls Joe had known in Fort Smith, none of whom could have kept up for 5 minutes. Joe didn't know what to make of her, and neither did July, or even Roscoe, who had found her. But soon they were far out on the plains, and it was clear to everyone that Janey was along for the trip. Chapter 53. Long before the whiskey boat stopped, Elmira knew she was going to have trouble with Biggs Way. The man had never approached her or even spoken to her, but every time she went out of her shed to sit and watch the water, she felt his eyes on her. And when they loaded the whiskey in wagons and started across the plains for Bent's Fort, his eyes followed her in whatever wagon she chose to ride for the day. It seemed to her it might be the fact that she was so small that made Biggs Way so interested. It was a problem she had had before. Huge men seemed to like her because she was so tiny. Biggs Way was even larger than the buffalo hunter who had caused her to run to July. Sometimes, in the evening, when he brought her her food, Fowler would sit and talk with her a bit. He had a scar which ran over his nose and down across his lips into his beard. He had a rough look, but his eyes were dreamy. "This whiskey haulin' business has about petered out," he said one evening. "Indians kept the trade going. Now they've about got them all penned up down in these parts. I may go up north." "Are there many towns up north?" she asked, remembering that Dee had mentioned going north. Dee liked his comforts, hotels and barber shops and such. Once she had offered to cut his hair and had made a mess of it. Dee had been good-natured about it, but he did remark that it paid to stick to professionals. He was vain about his looks. "There's Ogallala," Fowler said. "That's on the Platte. There's towns in Montana, but that's a long way." Biggs Way had a deep voice. She could sometimes hear him talking to the men even over the creak of the wagon wheels. He wore a long buffalo coat and seldom took it off, even when the days were hot. One morning there was great excitement. Just as the morning mists began to thin, the man on guard claimed to have seen 6 Indians on a ridge. He was a young man, very nervous. If there were Indians, they did not reappear. During the day, the men surprised 3 buffalo and killed one of them. That night Fowler brought Elmira samples of the liver and the tongue, the best parts, he said. The men had talked about the fort so much that Elmira had supposed it was a real town, but it was just a few scattered buildings, none in good repair. There was only one woman there, the wife of a blacksmith, and she had gone crazy due to the death of all 5 of her children. She sat in a chair all day, saying nothing to anyone. Fowler did his best for Elmira. He got the traders to let her have a little room, just a tiny, dirty closet, really. It was next to a warehouse where piles of buffalo skins were stored. The smell of the skins was worse than anything that had happened on the river. Her room was full of fleas that had escaped from the skins. She spent much of her time scratching. Though the fort was nothing much to see, it was a busy place, with riders coming and going all the time. Watching them, Elmira wished she was a man, so she could just buy a horse and ride away. The men let her alone, but they did look at her whenever she left her room. There were several wild-looking Mexicans who scared her worse than the buffalo hunters. After a week of scratching, she began to realize she had done a foolish thing taking the whiskey boat. In Fort Smith, all she had felt was an overwhelming desire to go. The day she left, she felt that her life depended on getting out of Fort Smith that day. She had a fear that July would suddenly show up again. She didn't regret leaving, but neither did she calculate on landing in a place as bad as Bent's Fort. In the cow towns, stages came and went at least. If you didn't like Dodge, you could always go to Abilene. But no stage came to Bent's Fort, just a wagon track that soon disappeared into the emptiness of the plains. Though she had not been bothered, the men at the fort looked very rough. "They don't think you're worth robbing," Fowler said, but she wasn't sure he was right. Some of the Mexicans looked like they might do worse than rob her if the mood struck them. Once, sitting under the little shed outside her room, she saw a fight between 2 Mexicans. She heard a yell and saw each man pull a knife. They went at one another like butchers. Their clothes were soon bloody, but evidently the cuts were not serious, for after a while they stopped fighting and went back to gambling together. Fowler said there might be a party of hunters going north, and that perhaps they would take her, but a week passed and the party didn't materialize. Then one day Fowler brought her a little plate of food under her shed. He looked at her sheepishly, as if he had something to say but didn't want to say it. "Biggs Way wants to marry you," he said finally, in an apologetic tone. "Well, I'm already married," she said. "What if he just wants to marry you temporary?" Fowler asked. "It's always temporary," Elmira said. "Why don't he ask himself?" "Zwei ain't much of a talker," Fowler said. "I've heard him talk," she said. "He talks to the men." Fowler laughed and said no more. Elmira felt angry. She was in a spot if some man was wanting to marry her. Someone had thrown a fresh buffalo skin into the warehouse, and she could hear the flies buzzing on it from where she sat. "He'll take you to Ogallala if you'll do it," Fowler said. "You might think about it. He ain't as bad as some." "How would you know?" she asked. "You ain't been married to him." Fowler shrugged. "He might be your best bet," he said. "I'm going back downriver next week. A couple of hide haulers are taking a load to Kansas, and they might take you, but it'd be a hard trip. You'd have to smell them stinking hides all the way. Anyway, the hide haulers are rough," he said. "I think Zwei would treat you all right." "I don't want to go to Kansas," she said. "I've been to Kansas." What ruined that was that she was pregnant and showing. Some of the saloons weren't particular, but it was always harder to get work if you were pregnant. Besides, she didn't want to work. She wanted Dee, who wouldn't mind that she was pregnant. Big Zwei began to spend hours just watching her. He didn't pretend to gamble or do anything else. He just watched her. She sat under her shed in one patch of shade, and he sat in another about 30 yards away, just watching. He didn't pretend to gamble or do anything else. Once, when he was watching, some riders spotted a little herd of buffalo. The other hunters were wild to go after them, but Zwei wouldn't go. They yelled at him and argued with him, but he just sat. Finally, they went off without him. One hunter tried to borrow his gun, but Zwei wouldn't give it up. He sat there with his big rifle across his lap, looking at Elmira. It became amusing to her, her power over the man. He had never spoken to her, not one word, and yet he would sit for hours, 30 yards away. It was something, what must go through men's minds where women were concerned, to cause them to behave so strangely. One morning she came out of her closet earlier than usual. She had a touch of morning sickness and wanted some fresh air. When she opened the door, she almost bumped into Big Zwei, who had just been standing outside her door. Her sudden appearance embarrassed him so that he gave her one appalled look and turned and went off, practically at a trot, putting a safe distance between them. He was a very heavy man, and the sight of him trying to run made her laugh out loud, something she hadn't done in a while. He didn't turn to look back at her again until he was safely back in his spot, and then he turned fearfully as if he expected to be shot for having stood by her door. "Tell him I'll go," she said to Fowler that evening. "I guess he ain't so bad." "You tell him," Fowler said. The next morning she walked over to where Big Zwei sat. When he saw her coming, it seemed for a second like he might bolt, but she was too close. Instead, he sat as if paralyzed, fear in his eyes. "I'll go if you think you can get me to Ogallala," she said. "I'll pay you what it's worth to you." Zwei didn't say anything. "How'll we travel?" she asked. "I ain't much good at riding horses." Big Zwei didn't respond for about a minute. Elmira was about to lose patience when he brushed his mouth with the back of his hand as if to clean it. "Could get that there hide wagon," he said, pointing to a run-down piece of equipment a few yards away. To Elmira, the wagon didn't look like it could travel 10 yards, much less all the way to Nebraska. "Could get the blacksmith to fix it," Big Zwei said. Now that he had spoken to her and not been struck by lightning, he felt a little easier. "Did you mean just us two to go?" Elmira asked. The question gave him so much pause that she almost wished she hadn't asked it. He fell silent again, his eyes troubled. "Might take Luke," he said. Luke was a weaselly little buffalo hunter with only a thumb and one finger on his left hand. He carried dice and gambled when he could get anyone to gamble with him. Once on the boat she had asked Fowler about him, and Fowler said a butcher had cut his fingers off with a cleaver for some reason. "When can we go?" she asked. It turned out to be a decision Big Zwei wasn't immediately up to making. He pondered the matter for some time, but reached no conclusion. "I want to get out of here," she said. "I'm tired of smelling buffalo hides." "Get that blacksmith to fix that wagon," Zwei responded. He stood up, picking up the tongue of the wagon, and began to drag it toward the blacksmith's shop 100 yards away. The next morning, the wagon, more or less patched, was sitting outside her closet. When she walked over to inspect it, she saw that Luke was in it, sleeping off a drunk. He slept with his mouth open, showing black teeth, and not many of them at that. Luke had ignored her on the trip upriver, but when he woke up, he hopped out of the wagon and came right over, a grin on his weaselly face. "Big Zwei and I have partnered up," he said. "Can you drive a wagon?" "I guess I could if we go slow," she said. Luke had spiky red hair that stuck out in all directions. A skinning knife, a foot long, was slung in a scabbard under one shoulder. He grinned constantly, exposing his black teeth, and, unlike Zwei, was not a bit afraid to look her in the eye. He had an insolent manner and spat tobacco juice constantly while he talked. "Zwei went to buy some mules," he said. "We got 2 horses, but they won't do for the wagon. Anyway, we might get some hides while you're driving the wagon." "I don't like the smell of hides," she said pointedly, but not pointedly enough for Luke to get the message. "You get where you don't smell 'em after a while," he said. "I don't hardly even notice it, I've smelled 'em so much." Luke had a little quirt, and was always nervously popping himself on the leg with it. "You skeered of Indians?" he asked. "I don't know," Elmira said. "I guess I don't like 'em much." "I've already killed 5 of them," Luke said. Biggs Way finally arrived, leading 2 scrawny mules and carrying a harness he had traded for. The harness was in bad repair, but there was plenty of rawhide around, and they soon had it tied together fairly well. Luke was quite dexterous with his thumb and little finger. He did better than Zwei, whose hands were too big for harness making. She soon got the hang of driving the mules. There was not much to it, for the mules were content to follow the 2 men on horseback. It was only when the men loped off to hunt that the mules were likely to balk. On the 2nd day out, with the men gone, she crossed a creek whose banks were so steep and rough that she felt sure the wagon would turn over. She was ready to jump and take her chances, but by a miracle it stayed upright. That day the men killed 20 buffalo. Elmira had to wait in the sun all day while they skinned them out. Finally, she got down and sat under the wagon, which provided a little shade. The men piled the bloody, smelly hides into the wagon, which didn't suit the mules. They hated the smell of hides as much as she did. Biggs Way had lapsed back into silence, leaving all the talking to Luke, who chattered away, whether anybody listened to him or not. Often Elmira had a nervous stomach. The jostling of the wagon took getting used to. The plains looked smooth in the distance, but they were surprisingly rough to pass over. Biggs Way had given her a blanket to put over the rough seat. It kept her from getting splinters, but didn't cushion the bumps. Alone with the 2 men in the middle of the great empty prairie, she felt apprehensive. In the cow towns there had been lots of girls around. If a man got mean, she could yell. On the boat it hadn't seemed as dangerous because the men were always fighting and gambling among themselves. But at night on the prairie, there were only the 3 of them, and nothing much to keep anyone busy. Biggs Way sat and looked at her through the campfire, and Luke looked too, while he talked. She didn't know if Biggs Way considered that in some way he had married her already. She worried that he might suddenly come over and want the marriage to begin, though so far he had been too shy even to speak to her much. For all she knew, he might expect her to be married to Luke too, and she didn't want that. The thought made her so nervous that she couldn't eat the buffalo meat they offered her. Anyway, it was tougher than any meat she had ever tried to chew. She chewed on one bite until her jaws got tired and then spat it out. But when she went to the wagon and made the one blanket into a kind of bed, neither man followed. She lay awake for a long time, apprehensive, but the men sat by the fire, occasionally looking her way, but making no move to disturb her. Luke got his dice out, and soon they were playing. Elmira was able to sleep, but awoke to the roll of thunder a few hours later. The men were asleep by the dying fire. Across the prairie she began to see lightning darting down the sky, and within a few minutes big drops of water hit her. In a minute she was wet. She jumped down and crawled under the wagon. It wasn't much protection, but it was some. Soon lightning was crashing all around, and the thunder came in big, flat cracks, as if a building had fallen down. It frightened her so that she hugged her knees and trembled. When the lightning struck, the whole prairie would be bathed for a second in white light. The rainstorm soon passed, but she lay awake for the rest of the night, listening to water drip off the wagon. It grew very dark. She didn't know what might have happened to the men. But in the morning they were right where they had gone to sleep, wet as muskrats, but ready to drink a pot of coffee. Neither even commented on the storm. Elmira decided they were used to hard traveling, and that she had better get used to it too. Soon she began to talk to the mules as they plodded along. She didn't say much, and the mules didn't answer, but it made the long, hot days pass a little faster. Chapter 54. Augustus spent half the first day finding the tracks, for Blue Duck had been cool enough to lead Lorena through the stampeding cattle, so that their tracks would be blotted out by the thousands of cattle tracks. It was a fine trick, and one not many men would dare to try. Years had passed since Augustus had done any serious tracking. He rode around all morning trying to remember the last man he had tracked, just to give himself perspective. It seemed to him that the last man had been an incompetent horse thief named Webster Witter, who had rustled horses in the Blanco country at one time. He and Call had gone after him one day by themselves and caught him and hung him before sundown. But the tracking had been elemental, due to the fact that the man had been driving 40 stolen horses. The thing he remembered best about Webster Witter was that he had been a tall man, and they caught him out in the scrub and had to hang him to a short tree. It was that or take him back, and Call was against taking him back. Call believed summary justice was often the only justice, and in those days he was right, since they had to depend on circuit judges who often as not didn't show up. "If we take him back, he'll bribe the jailer or dig out or something, and we'll have to catch him at it again," Call said. It never occurred to Call just to shoot someone he could hang, and in this instance Augustus didn't suggest it, for they had rushed out without much ammunition and were traveling in rough country. Fortunately, Webster's neck broke when they whipped the horse out from under him. Otherwise, he could have stood there and laughed at them, for the limb of the mesquite sagged badly, and both his feet drug the ground. That had been at least 12 years ago, and Augustus soon concluded that his tracking skills had rusted to the point of being unusable. The only horse tracks he found for the first 3 hours belonged to Hat Creek horses. He almost decided to go back and get Dietz, though he knew Call would be reluctant to surrender him. Finally, by circling wide to the northwest, Augustus crossed the 3 horses' tracks. Blue Duck had tried the one trick, crossing the stampede, but that was all. After that, the tracks bore straight for the northwest so unerringly that Augustus soon found he didn't need to pay much attention to them. If he lost them, he could usually pick them up within half a mile. He rode as hard as he dared, but he had only one horse and couldn't afford to ruin him. At each watering, he let him have a few minutes of rest. He rode all night, and the next day the tracks were still bearing northwest. He felt unhappy with himself, for he wasn't catching up. Lorena was getting a taste of hard travel, the like of which she had never imagined. Probably she would have worse to deal with than hard travel, unless she was very lucky, and Augustus knew it was his fault. He should have packed her into camp the minute he discovered who Blue Duck was. In retrospect, he couldn't imagine why he hadn't. It was the kind of lapse he had been subject to all his life. Things that were clearly dangerous didn't worry him enough. He tried to swallow his regrets and concentrate on finding her. After all, it had happened, and why he had let it no longer particularly mattered. Blue Duck was a name from their past. Having him show up in their midst 15 years later had thrown his reasoning off. The second day he stopped tracking altogether, since it was plain Blue Duck was heading for the Staked Plains. That took in a lot of territory, of course, but Augustus thought he knew where Blue Duck would go, to an area north and west of the Palo Duro Canyon. It was there he had always retreated to when pursued. Once Call and he had sat on the western edge of the great canyon, looking across the brown, waterless distances to the west. They had finally decided to end their pursuit there, while they had a fair chance of getting back alive. It wasn't Indians they feared so much as lack of water. It had been midsummer, and the plains looked seared. What grass there was, brown and brittle. Call was frustrated. He hated to turn back before he caught his man. "There's got to be water out there," Call said. "They cross it, and they can't drink dirt." "Yes, but they know where it is, and we don't," Augustus pointed out. "They can kill their horses getting to it. They got more horses. But if we kill ours, it's a darn long walk back to San Antonio." That afternoon, he crossed the clear fork of the Brazos and passed a half-built cabin, abandoned and empty. It was a vivid enough reminder of the power of the Comanches. Their massacres caused plenty of settlers to retreat while they still had legs to retreat on. Call and he had watched through the 50s as the line of the frontier advanced, only to collapse soon after. The men and women who came up the Trinity and the Brazos were no strangers to hardship, but hardship was one thing, terror another. The land was spacious and theirs for the taking, but land couldn't cancel out fear, a fact that Call never understood. It annoyed him that the whites gave up and retreated. "I wish they'd stick," he said many times. "If they would, there'd soon be enough of them to beat back the Indians." "You ain't never laid in bed all night with a scared woman," Augustus said. "You can't start a farm if you've got to live in a fort. Them that starts the farms have got to settle off by themselves, which means they're easy to cut off and carve up." "Well, they could leave the women for a while," Call said. "Send for them when it's safe." "Yes, but a man that goes to the trouble to take a wife don't generally want to go off and leave her," Augustus pointed out. "It means doing the chores all by yourself. Besides, without a wife handy, you won't be getting no kids, and kids are a wonderful source of free labor. They're cheaper than slaves by a damn sight." They had argued the point for years, but fruitlessly, for Call had no sympathy for human weakness. Augustus put it down to a lack of imagination. Call could never imagine what it was like to be scared. They had been in tight spots, but usually that meant action, and in battles, things happened too fast for fear to paralyze the mind of a man like Call. He couldn't imagine what it was like to go to bed every night scared that you and your family would feel the knives of the Comanches before sunrise. That night, Augustus stopped to rest his horse, making a cold camp on a little bluff and eating some jerky he had brought along. He was in the scrubby post oak country near the Brazos, and from his bluff could see far across the moonlit valleys. It struck him that he had forgotten emptiness such as existed in the country that stretched around him. After all, for years he had lived within the sound of the piano from the Dry Bean, the sound of the church bell in the little Lonesome Dove church, the sound of Ball whacking the dinner bell. He even slept within the sound of P.I.'s snoring, which was as regular as the ticking of a clock. But here there was no sound, not any. The coyotes were silent, the crickets, the locusts, the owls. There was only the sound of his own horse grazing. From him to the stars, in all directions, there was only silence and emptiness. Not the talk of men over their cards, nothing. Though he had ridden hard, he felt strangely rested, just from the silence. The next day he found the carcass of Laurie's mare. By the end of the day he was out of the scrub. When he crossed the Wichita, he angled west. He had not seen Blue Duck's tracks in 2 days, but he didn't care. He had always had confidence in his instincts, and felt he knew where the man would stop. Possibly he was bound for Adobe Walls, one of the Bent's old forts. This one, on the Canadian, had never been much of a success. The Bents had abandoned it, and it became a well-known gathering place for buffalo hunters, as well as for anyone crossing the plains. It was spring. What few buffalo were left would be moving north, and what buffalo hunters were left would be gathered at the old fort, getting ready for a last hide harvest. Buffalo hunters were not known to be too particular about their company. Though Blue Duck and his men had picked off plenty of them over the years, the new crop would probably overlook that fact if he turned up with a prize like Lorena. Also, there were still renegade bands of Kiowas and Comanches loose on the plains. The bands were supposedly scattered, at least that was the talk in South Texas, and the trade in captives virtually dead. But Augustus wasn't in South Texas anymore, and as he rode through the empty country, he had plenty of time to consider that maybe the talk hadn't been all that accurate. Talk often wasn't. The bands were doomed, but they might last another year or two, whereas he was advancing into their country in the here and now. He wasn't afraid for himself, but he was afraid for Lorena. Blue Duck might be dealing with some renegade chief with a taste for white women. Lorena would put a nice cap on a career largely devoted to stealing children. If Blue Duck intended to trade her to an Indian, he would probably take her farther west through the region known as the Kitake, and then north to a crossing on the Canadian where the Comanches had traded captives for decades. Nearby was the famous Valley of Tears, spoken of with anguish by such captives as had been recovered. There the Comancheros divided captives, mothers being separated from their children and sold to different bands, the theory being that if they were isolated, they would be less likely to organize escapes. As he moved into the Quitaque, a parched country where shallow red canyons stretched west toward the Palo Duro, Augustus would see little spiraling dust devils rising from the exposed earth far ahead of him. During the heat of the day, mirages in the form of flat lakes appeared, so vivid that a time or two he almost convinced himself there was water ahead, although he knew there wasn't. He decided to head first for the big crossing on the Canadian. If there was no sign of blue duck there, he could always follow the river over to the Walls. He crossed the Prairie Dog fork of the Red River, plenty of prairie dogs were in evidence too, and rode west to the edge of the Palo Duro. Several times he saw small herds of buffalo, and twice rode through valleys of bleached bones, places where hunters had slaughtered several hundred animals at a time. By good luck he found a spring and spent the night by it, resting his horse for the final push. Late the next day he came into the breaks of the Canadian, a country of shallow, eroded gullies. He could see where the river curved east across the plains. He rode east for several miles, hoping to cross Blue Duck's tracks. He didn't, which convinced him he had guessed wrong in coming so far west. The man had probably gone directly to the Walls and pitched Lorena into the laps of a bunch of buffalo hunters. Before he had time to lament his error, though, Augustus saw a sight which took his mind off it completely. He saw a speck moving across the plains north toward the river. At first he thought it might be Blue Duck, but if so, he was traveling without Lorena. There was only one speck. His horse saw the speck, too. Augustus drew his rifle, in the case the speck turned out to be hostile. He loped toward it, only to discover an old man with a dirty white beard pushing a wheelbarrow across the plains. The wheelbarrow contained buffalo bones. As if that wasn't unusual enough, Augustus found that he even knew the man. His name was Os Frank, and he had started as a mountain man, trapping beaver. He had once kept a store in Waco, but for some reason got mad and robbed the bank next to his store. The bank had thought they were getting along with him fine until the day he walked in and robbed them. Augustus and Call were in Waco at the time, and though Call was reluctant to bother with bank robbers, he felt bankers were so stupid they deserved robbing, they were persuaded to go after him. They caught him right away, but not without a gun battle. The battle took place in a thicket on the Brazos, where Os Frank had stopped to cook some venison. It went on for 2 hours and resulted in no injuries. Then Os Frank ran out of ammunition and had been easy enough to arrest. He cursed them all the way back to Waco and broke out of jail the day they left town. Augustus had not heard of him since, yet there he was, wheeling a barrow full of buffalo bones across the high plains. He didn't seem to be armed, so Augustus rode right up to him, keeping his rifle across his saddle. The old robber could well have a pistol hidden in the bones, though unless his aim had improved, he was not much of a threat even if he did. "Hello, Os," Augustus said as he rode up. "Have you gone in the bone business, or what?" The old man squinted at him for a moment, but made no reply. He kept on wheeling his barrow full of bones over the rough ground. Tobacco drippings had stained his beard until most of it was a deep brown. "I guess you don't remember me," Augustus said, falling in beside him. "I'm Captain McCrae. We shot at one another all afternoon once up on the Brazos. You was in one thicket, and me and Captain Call was in the next one. We pruned the post oaks with all that shooting, and then we stuck you in jail, and you crawled right out again." "I don't like you much," Os Frank said, still trundling. "Put me in the goddamn jail." "Well, why'd you rob that bank?" Augustus said. "It ain't Christian to rob your neighbors. It ain't Christian to hold a grudge, neither. Wasn't you born into the Christian religion?" "No," Os Frank said. "What do you want?" "A white girl," Augustus said. "Pretty one. An outlaw carried her off. You may know him. His name is Blue Duck." Os Frank stopped the wheelbarrow. He needed to spit and leaned over. and spat a large mouthful of tobacco juice directly into the hole of a red ant bed. The ants, annoyed, scurried about in all directions. Augustus laughed. Os Frank had always been an original. In Waco, as he remembered, he had caused controversy because he never seemed to sleep. The lantern in his store would be on at all hours of the night, and the man would often be seen roaming the streets at 3 in the morning. Nobody knew what he was looking for, or if he found it. "Now that's a new trick," Augustus said, "spitting on ants. I guess that's all you've got to do besides haul bones." Os Frank resumed his walk, and Augustus followed along, amused at the strange turns life took. Soon they came down into the valley of the Canadian. Augustus was amazed to see an enormous pyramid of buffalo bones, perhaps 50 yards from the water. The bones were piled so high, it seemed to him Os Frank must have a ladder to use in his piling, though he saw no sign of one. Down the river, a quarter of a mile, there was another pyramid, just as large. "Well, Os, I see you've been busy," Augustus said. "You'll be so rich one of these days, some bank will come along and rob you. Who do you sell these bones to?" Os Frank ignored the question. While Augustus watched, he pushed his wheelbarrow up to the bottom of the pyramid of bones and began to throw the bones as high as possible up the pyramid. Once or twice he got a leg bone or a thigh bone all the way to the top, but most of the bones hit midway and stuck. In 5 minutes the big wheelbarrow was empty. Without a word, Os Frank took the wheelbarrow and started back across the prairie. Augustus decided to rest while the old man worked. Such camp as there was rudimentary. Os had dug a little cave in one of the red bluffs south of the river, and his gear was piled in front of it. There was a buffalo gun and a few pots and pans, and that was it. The main crossing was a mile downriver, and Augustus rode down to inspect it before unsaddling. There were horse tracks galore, but not those he was looking for. He saw 5 pyramids of bones between the crossing and Os Frank's camp, each containing several tons of bones. Back at the camp, Augustus rested in the shade of the little bluff. Os Frank continued to haul in bones until sundown. After pitching his last load up on the pyramid, he wheeled the barrow to his camp, turned it over, and sat on it. He looked at Augustus for 2 or 3 minutes without saying anything. "Well, are you going to invite me for supper or not?" Augustus asked. "Never should have arrested me," Os Frank said. "I don't like that goddamn bank." "You didn't stay in jail but 4 hours," Augustus reminded him. "Now that I've seen how hard you work, I'd say you probably needed the rest. You could have studied English or something. I see you've learned it finally." "I don't like the goddamn bank," Os repeated. "Let's talk about something else," Augustus suggested. "You're just lucky you didn't get shot on account of that bank. Me and Call were both fine shots in those days. The thicket was the only thing that saved you." "They cheated me because I couldn't talk good," Os Frank said. "You got a one-track mind, Os," Augustus said. "You and half of mankind. How long you been up here on the Canadian River?" "I come 5 years," Os said. "I want a store." "That's fine, but you've outrun the people," Augustus said. "They won't be along for another 10 years or so. I guess by then you'll have a hell of a stock of buffalo bones. I just hope there's a demand for them." "Had a wagon," Os Frank said. "Got stole. Apaches got it." "That's so?" Augustus said. "I didn't know the Apaches lived around here." "Over by the Pecos," Os said. "I quit the mountains. Don't like snow." "I'll pass on snow myself when I have the option," Augustus said. "This is a lonely place you've settled in, though. Don't the Indians bother you?" "They leave me be," Os said. "That one you're hunting, he's a mean one. He killed Bob, built a fire under him, and let him sizzle. He don't bother me, though," he added. "Killed Bob and let me be." "Bob who?" "Old Bob that I was in the mountains with," Os said. "Well, his burning days are over if I find him," Augustus said. "He's quick, Blue Duck," Os said. "Has some Kiowas with him. They ate my dog." "How many Kiowas?" Augustus asked. "It was a big dog," Os said. "Killed 2 wolves.
I had a few sheep once, but the Mexicans run them off.
It's a chancy life out here on the plains, Augustus said. I bet you get a nice breeze in the winter, too.
Them Kiowas ate that dog,
Oss repeated.
Good dog.
Why ain't Blue Duck killed you? Augustus asked.
Laughs at me,
Oss said.
Laughs at my bones. He says he'll kill me when he gets ready.
How many Kiowas does he run around with? Augustus asked again. The old man was evidently not used to having anyone to talk to. His remarks came out a little jerky.
6,
Oss Frank said.
Who's over at the walls?
Augustus asked. The old man didn't answer. Darkness had fallen, and Augustus could barely see him sitting on his wheelbarrow.
No beaver in this river,
Oss Frank said after several minutes. No, a beaver would be foolish to be in this river, Augustus said. There ain't a tree within 20 miles, and beavers like to gnaw trees. You should have stayed up north if you like beavers.
I'd rather gather these bones, the old man said. You don't have to get your feet wet.
Did you get to Montana when you was a beaver man? Augustus waited several minutes for a reply, but the old man never answered. When the moon came up, Augustus saw that he had fallen asleep sitting on his wheelbarrow, his head fallen over in his arms. Augustus was tired and hungry. He lay where he was, thinking about food, but making no effort to get up and fix any, if there was any to be fixed. While he was thinking he ought to get up and eat, he fell asleep. Deep in the night a sound disturbed him, and he came awake and drew his pistol. It was well on toward morning. He could tell that by the moon, but the sound was new to him. Cautiously he turned over, only to see at once that the source of the sound was Oss Frank. He had risen in the night and collected another load of buffalo bones. Now he was heaving them up on the pyramid. The sound that had awakened Augustus was the sound of bones, clicking and rattling as they slid down the sides of the pyramid. Augustus holstered his pistol and walked over to watch the old man. "You're an unusual fellow, Oss," he said. "I guess you just work night and day. You should have partnered up with Woodrow Call. He's as crazy about work as you are. The two of you might own the world by now if you'd hooked up." Oss Frank didn't respond. He had emptied the wheelbarrow, and he pushed it up the slope, away from the river. Augustus caught his horse and rode east. On his way, he saw Oss Frank again, working under the moonlight. He had plenty to work with, for the plain around was littered with buffalo bones. It looked as if a whole herd had been wiped out, for a road of bones stretched far across the plain. He remembered when he had first come to the high plains years before. For 2 days, he and Call and the rangers had ridden parallel to the great southern buffalo herd, hundreds of thousands of animals slowly grazing north. It had been difficult to sleep at night because the horses were nervous around so many animals, and the sounds of the herd were constant. They had ridden for nearly 100 miles and seldom been out of sight of buffalo. Of course, they had heard that the buffalo were being wiped out, but with the memory of the southern herd so vivid, they had hardly credited the news. Discussing it in Lonesome Dove, they had decided that the reports must be exaggerated. Thinned out, maybe, but not wiped out.